Laurel Downs, and I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I work on the Don't Move Firewood campaign. And we are very excited this year to host some Emerald Ash Borer themed webinars for Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week, very appropriately enough. And I'm very excited to have Dr. Schneider with us today to talk about public acceptance of Emerald Ash Borer and different communication strategies in this new technological era. And just before I give her the reins, I'm going to just briefly kind of give you some background and context on this pest, as well as our campaign and the things, that we try to do and convey to the public in terms of invasive species and the firewood pathway. So there we go. I think it's important to just talk very briefly about quarantines, as this is how species like Emerald Ash Borer are regulated in the country. So there are external or exterior quarantines that's trying to keep something out of an area, and then there are internal or interior quarantines trying to contain pests within an area. And a lot of these pest-based quarantines have firewood as a regulated article, and so with an Emerald Ash Borer quarantine, you'll have many different regulated articles, things that, are known to carry this pest. Firewood, as we know, is a big pathway for this pest to spread from one area to another. We did have a federal domestic quarantine on Emerald Ash Borer for 22 years. This was recently rescinded in early 2021. So we do still have an exterior quarantine domestically or federally, so we're still trying to keep Emerald Ash Borer out of the country, but we no longer have a federal regulation preventing this pest from moving from state to state. So now that's really left a lot of the states and other various landowning entities to their own ends, whether or not they want to regulate this pest and how. And with a big nationwide report that we've done recently, we looked at all different sorts of pest quarantines and firewood quarantines, and we saw that, states often do have regulations for their pests, but this is not necessarily Emerald Ash Borer specific. If you look at Emerald Ash Borer specifically, it's a lot less inclusive. So we have 7 states that have exterior quarantines on an Emerald Ash Borer specifically. We have other states that have firewood quarantines that cover Emerald Ash Borer, and then we have some states that are in transition. But as you can see, a lot less coverage for Emerald Ash Borer compared to pests in general. Then we have those interior regulations as well. So 8 states already have all or a portion of the state that is infested with this pest. They're trying to contain it. And then we have other states that again have firewood specific regulations that cover EAB, at least on the firewood pathway. I'm not going to go too much into certification, but a big part of the firewood side of the regulation of Emerald Ash Borer is that if you want firewood moved in and out of places with regulations, it has to be certified heat treated firewood to kill the pest within. The federal regulation used to afford states the ability to do that. They no longer do so. But a lot of states do have their own state-based firewood certification programs, but again, it's not inclusive. So as an outreach campaign, we're constantly looking for outreach and trying to help, different partners and entities improve their outreach. And so we are part of this big report we did, which I can put in the chat if anyone's interested in looking at. We looked at firewood communications across different metrics across the United States. So state agencies, cooperative extension, state park, and then the reservation process for state parks as well. And this is the sort of messaging that we love to see, firewood alert, firewood information on camping pages, anywhere where we think firewood users are actually likely to go. And as you can imagine, not a lot of people are looking for firewood specific information on these sites. So it's really nice when it's, jumping out and then people can realize like, oh, this is a problem and I should be cognizant of that. And we saw a lot of variation across the state. State agency websites tended to have the most and the best outreach. This was typically on Department of Agriculture sites. which is great, and that's important. And it's usually because those are the entities behind regulations. But the states where a lot of firewood users are likely to go, definitely not as much communication. So we're working with these partners and trying to increase that outreach and get the word out that firewood can carry invasive species like emerald ash borer, and everyone has a part to play, and really the ability to help slow the spread of this pest. Again, this is just showing like these outreach metrics were a little just all over the place. And then, so we as an outreach campaign and a nonprofit can really help with the outreach side of things, as you can imagine. And we provide a free service that we can customize graphics and just really put whatever, whether it be a regulation or just, best practice messaging, we can customize those messages for states and partners and at a free service. So any costs associated with this would be printing costs if you were to want to print them out. And I'm going to leave questions for me at the end so I can give over to Dr. Schneider, because I'm really excited to hear her talk. And so I will stop talking. Take it away, Dr. Schneider.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see how this looks. And you should be seeing a full-size screen. Great. Okay. Thank you again so much. And thanks for sharing that background, Laurel. Very interesting and useful. I'm not here specifically to talk about firewood, but perhaps some of the work I've done will address some of that firewood and regulation. So as you know, my talk is titled Addressing Emerald Ash Borer, Understanding and Influencing Public Acceptance of Management Options as these communication technology evolves. Laurel mentioned printing out signs and brochures, as well as some online communication. So there's a whole plethora of things that have been happening. And I've got an amazing team who have been working specifically on this, including Angela Gupta from Extension here in Minnesota, Drs. Marcella Windmuller, Campioni, and Matt Russell, a multimedia production team from Wild Carrot is its name, with Pat O'Leary at the University of Minnesota, a wonderful technology lab, and graduate students Brett Ranow, Ella Weber, and Elena Chikakis, who are listed on the next slide. So to say that the way we communicate has come a long way is certainly an understatement. From the first cell phone in 1973 to the iPhone of 14 of 2023, things have really changed. And this change includes the coronation of the 21st century as the virtual century. And that virtual communication experiences were certainly accelerated by the ever-present COVID virus, which we all know well and have experienced in the past few years. So opportunities exist to use these advanced and dynamic communication technologies related to invasive species. And emerging and engaging technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality offer promise to improve the public engagement and knowledge and understanding, both from theoretical and practical perspectives. So theory actually suggests that messaging is more effective as it becomes more engaging or interactive, because it encourages elaboration on the message and subsequent attitude and behavior changes. Practically speaking, these engaging technologies are timely and in step with current trends in our virtual century. Still, they remain under-researched, particularly in terrestrial invasive species management like EAB. And EAB offers a really interesting and timely application to study the effectiveness of these types of communication, because EAB infestation is serious and ongoing issue. We know that the public wants some sort of action, but its acceptance of such action really varies. And despite its presence in the US for nearly 2 decades, any depth of knowledge about EAB is really low overall, at least I think in Minnesota. So while a majority of our folks in our samples have heard of it, they indicate they know little about it. And in fact, about a third are unaware if it's in their community or on their property or at a recreation site they visited. So there is a real opportunity to educate and inform folks. To that end, in case you're on this webinar and not familiar with emerald ash borer, it's a costly and destructive insect capable of killing individual trees within 4 years and subsequently causing wide-scale mortality of entire ash stands within a decade. Now, in North America, it was discovered in 2002, and it preys exclusively on ash, although there have been some recent published studies that it might affect some ornamental species. Nearly a decade ago, so 2013, it was considered the most destructive forest pest ever seen in North America. And at that time, American Forests called it an ecological catastrophe with staggering economic costs. Beyond the US, globally, EAB's southward migration from Russia threatens olive plantations in Southern Europe and the Middle East. As of spring 2023, EAB had been detected in all the US places with these red dots. How did this happen, you ask? Well, EAB can fly, but they only move about 1/2 to 1 mile a year from infested sites. But people carry it, right? And hundreds of miles when transporting firewood and other wood. That's the very important work of the Nature Conservancy in this campaign. So it is clearly an issue and a communication opportunity, which brought us to this project. So we wanted to explore the use of these advanced communication technologies in forest management as it related to EAB. So prior to this project, I spent about a decade exploring if and what the public knows about EAB and their perceptions of forest management in response to it. So I'll be sharing some of that as well as the influencing. But before I dive in, I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where I'm located, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. We reside on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. I've introduced our team from the University of Minnesota, and you see here the 2 additional graduate students located on the slide. And I want to thank the Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center at the University of Minnesota for funding for a variety of projects, including the communication technology one. So following the title, I'm going to share a bit about how we went about understanding and then influencing acceptance of forest management in response to EAB. So there's 2 major portions of the presentation. The first portion will address work in the last decade and the progression of understanding. And then about the next portion, each 15 to 20 minutes, will address the details on the advanced communication technologies. A bit of a preview. Essentially, it all boils down to what we're terming ACT at this point, or acronym. Is based on the work that we've done and others have done. We're encouraging people to act. That means act initially, doing something about emerald ash borer. Research consistently suggests people want action. Then whatever you're going to do to inform and educate the constituents about what you did. There are a lot of questions when things happen and there's no information provided. Also, what we found was to consider the context. If you're messaging about visitor use areas versus more natural oriented areas, there is a difference on what's going to be necessary and most effective. Timing is important, both with the management that you're doing and photos you might use to depict that in terms of acceptability. And finally, terms are important, both within teams you might work with to create communications, as well as the terms you'll use for the public. So how did we come to our acronym ACT? Let's find out. So the first part includes a bit of the previous work I've done to date to understand visitor perceptions of EAB in forest management. I want to thank the funders who supported this work, including the Forest Service, the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plant Pest Center, agency collaborators, again, the Park Service, Forest Service here in the United States, Austria and German national parks, state DNR here in Minnesota and in Colorado, some cities in the city of St. Paul and Vienna, as well as my amazing collaborators and authors I'll be naming throughout. So our understanding of EAB and perceptions of it began about a decade ago. So EAB was discovered in Minnesota in 2009. And a few years later, we initiated interviews with park visitors to explore if and how EAB would impact and influence their visitation and generally of their experiences. So the questions that we used were grounded in landscape preference research and a leisure constraints framework, which asserts that changes in the environment will influence or constrain visitation. And as of 2013, neither of these were connected to landscape and EAB and constraints. So we sought to fill this gap. We conducted some on-site informal interviews with a convenient sample of visitors at 2 different state parks in Minnesota, which at that time was the western edge of EAB infestation. We shared this photo that you're seeing of an EAB infested landscape and asked park visitors their perceptions of it and how they would respond to it. Results were reviewed between our interviewers and then descriptively analyzed. So what we found is that the interviews revealed concerned and uninformed visitors. The majority of visitors reacted negatively to the EAB impacted area, and the words they used to describe the pictures made participants feel sad, concerned, upset, disappointed, thought it was unfortunate, and ugly. Concerns about the EAB infestation and its management included the general loss of ash trees in general, the spread of EAB, and was it the use incorrectly managed areas? Would they be doing incorrect management to address what it was? The loss of forest diversity. And it was also clear that there was a lack of public knowledge, both about EAB and chemicals that might be used. They were quite concerned. So moving forward, we conducted a quantitative assessment of the acceptance of forest management in response to EAB that was happening at that time. We returned to a Minnesota state park where EAB was confirmed and asked visitors if and how much they found typical treatments acceptable on a simple 5-point scale of acceptability. The treatments that we assessed included doing nothing, which would result in landscapes like this, 4 different types of harvesting, chemical treatment, biological control use, and wood regulations, like Laurel talked about in the introduction. But when we asked people about the acceptability of these, 3 of 8 were unacceptable: doing nothing, and the chemical treatment and biological controls. You see that wood regulations were found acceptable. So, armed with this information about what visitors thought about EAB and some of their concerns, as well as acceptance for forest management in response to EAB, the next question became, well, how important is the forest condition really compared to some other things? So we conducted some more visitor studies of state and local parks across the United States in Minnesota, Colorado, and also in Germany. And we created a variety of visual scenarios, manipulating what visitors saw to do an analysis and understand the relative preferences they have. As you look at these 4 photos, you'll see that there are differences in the backgrounds that we have. We have some development here agriculturally, a cityscape, and then more natural in the background. In the midground, we've got some bushes, we've got emerald ash borer standing trees, and some planted trees. And then we also have a variety of visitor numbers, types, and dogs on and off leash. So we created 128 scenarios actually, but visitors only saw and responded to 16. And then we were able to discern what was most important through an analysis called discrete choice. We asked people what landscape would you be most likely to visit, least likely to visit, as well as preferences. And when we did this, we found that the forest condition was the 3rd most important contributor to visit intention. And I'm reporting here just one of 4 sites at this point. So the background was very important, as were visitor numbers, and then forestry condition came in 3rd. So that is kind of a baseline of understanding emerald ash borer knowledge and perceptions among visitors. I'll get to the influencing in the next part, but I thought I'd take just a break now because we've been talking about 20 minutes in total, and ask if there's any questions, concerns, or thoughts, as well as share the relevant publications.
Dr. Schneider, Gary Fish from the state of Maine inquired about some of your terminology choices on incorrect management, as well as the difference between chemical treatment or using the term insecticides. So if you could talk about those different terminology choices, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah. So the incorrect management were the words of the interviewees. They were concerned about what they were doing and would whoever was managing it, what were they doing and were they doing it right or incorrectly? They were concerned about future environmental damage. And yes, thank you for that question about chemicals that we used. In that study, we had an information sheet that explained each of the treatments, and insecticide was identified. It wasn't just insecticide as a name for that. So, and I actually, my last slide has a copy of that handout, so I can show you that in a second.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Just get back to my notes here. Okay, great. All right, well, if you'd like, you can stand up and do a quick shake break, because as an instructor, I do know that sitting is the new smoking, and that our bodies really do like a little bit of a break to stand up. And I recently read about joy movements are those if you reach up, sway, bounce, or shake. So just to keep us awake mid-afternoon. All right, so the next portion of this then became trying to understand how we can impact acceptance of various management approaches, given the lack of knowledge about EAB and the opportunity to educate and inform. So in particular, we were interested in testing a control, the typical placard you might see at a trailhead, as well as augmented reality and virtual reality. And we did this across 4 common harvesting approaches that are used in forestry in Minnesota, and they include select harvest planted trees here in the upper left, select harvest natural regeneration in the upper right, complete harvest with natural regeneration in the lower left, and doing nothing in the lower right. We wanted to inform the folks about the common harvesting and see what they would find most acceptable. So we embarked on an 18-month process that integrated best practices in message and medium development, iterative stakeholder involvement, and multimedia teams. And again, our goal was to assess and compare the visitor acceptance of management across these communication mediums. So I'll discuss the process in 2 portions, the development and then the deployment and our lessons learned throughout. I was really grateful that this process was guided by a multi-agency advisory group. So our message development process took 9 to 12 months or so, and it was initiated across 3 phases: visitor focus groups, expert development review, and a visitor review. So first we conducted focus groups, and we recruited from statewide partnership groups of people who participate in the outdoors. And they were screened that they had visited outdoor recreation in the last space in the last 12 months that was forested. They weren't employed in forestry, and they were Minnesota residents. We divided them into high and low knowledge categories because we wanted to differentiate them, because we do know that sometimes awareness does impact acceptance. And then we invited them to do focus groups, and they were online, and they responded to questions about emerald ash borer and its management, as well as responded to photos. And it was an iterative process back and forth about questions they had that we could answer. They were offered $30 to complete the discussion online, and each of our groups had between 7 and 8 participants. We learned a lot through that. Participants really indicated they wanted more information about what was happening. They wanted to differentiate why the landscape had changed. Was it fire, insect, storm? People didn't really know what landscapes recovering from different disturbances looked like. We thought the area we showed them might have been burned or damaged by wind, or maybe it was just spring. They wanted to know what was happening and what were the benefits for management, particularly with the planted trees and cuts. They saw connections and wanted connections to the future forest health, to invasive species and stewardship, support for restoration, stewardship, wildlife and recreation. And they had concerns that maybe these were hazard trees or areas might have more invasives. And they also indicated they were interested in exploring the trees. People were really curious about the disturbance and management. So therefore, as we were developing messages and our informational interventions, we thought we really wanted to include the motivations and benefits that any actions being taken with attention to the landscape diversity, forest health, and opportunities to attract or retain wildlife, connections to the landscape transformations and future outlooks with attention to forest health, invasive species and stewardship, and then opportunities for responsible recreation. Informational statements and hotspots that related to the clear-cut treatment might include, for example, reference to the buffer and its positive aesthetics and ecological benefit as a best management practice, layers and left stumps, why they might be there and why the trees were cut, and a close-up of those layers. So that was the visitor focus group, part one of that. Based on this rich data from those focus groups, our research team developed messages. And this is where we were integrating best practices for interpretation. So seeking messages and text geared toward an 8th grade reading level and vocabulary, and best practices for the various mediums. So we looked at the length of message that optimized both reading and hearing, because we were going to have printed and heard messages in the augmented and virtual reality. So for example, on the total number of words per sign tend to be within 40 to 150 words, and sentences varied in length and structure with chunked paragraphs. Our theme statements were targeted to a maximum of 25 words, and the entire management text, we were striving for 200 words and targeted to 2 minutes or less for listening. We also paid attention, obviously, to text sizes and visual and text balance in the augmented and virtual reality. So with all of this, we created the 4 themes and sub-themes about the 4 different treatments regarding the forest management response to EAB. And as we were not the experts, we invited expert review. So we had 18 regional communication experts evaluate the messages we developed for effectiveness, persuasiveness, and engagement level. And effectiveness was operationalized in 2 areas, both informing and appealing to the audience, persuasiveness, and then engagement for how emotional and intellectually engaging they found they were. So based on that review, we revisited and refined the messages toward greater effectiveness. Ultimately, visitors were our target audience. So the 3rd step and final step on the message development journey was to ask them to evaluate the messages. So we shared draft messages with a sample of Minnesota outdoor recreationists recruited for, but not participating in the focus groups. So they evaluated the message appeal, informative qualities, the persuasiveness and understandability of the messages. They also asked if it sparked interest in the topic. So based on those inputs, we finalized the messages and integrated the interactive elements for augmented and virtual reality. We acquired visual and audio assets concurrent with the messages that we had developed. So we both proactively collected 360 video seasonally, because our focus groups happened in June, and then we were out in the field in July, and we took a lot that we knew we might use. And we had sound and photos based on the focus group data. Wonderful multimedia team there. So here's an example of the text and photo message for one of the 4 treatments. And this is for select harvest planted trees. our theme statement, title, 4 text blocks, and pictures that illustrate and go deep for those text blocks. We had 4 of these, and it was typical to what you might see. It was a 9x12 laminated piece. So we then took this same messaging and visualized it and developed it in augmented and virtual reality formats. We used what they call a Zapper app, which is like a QR, but different, and put 4 codes on an emerald ash borer log and had that at our site for visitors to tap into and get the information. We provided a tablet and they would get information by activating the code on one of those 4 messages. They were supposed to listen to all 4 messages, which they did. And to do that, they just would click on a floating informational blurb via touch screen. So you'll see what it is. Let me demonstrate here. I encourage you to check your audio and make sure it is up so you can hear this. So you'll see the person go and click on the ash log and get some information. So this works.
Killing Minnesota's ash trees and putting forests and humans at risk.
Now they'll go and click something to get more information.
Trained foresters use the best available information to manage our forests. Foresters minimize emerald ash borer risk and keep forests healthy, diverse, and productive.
So there's an example of the augmented reality. Now, similar message in the virtual reality, and you'll be able to see the difference in immersion.
Forests cleared with emerald ash borer threatened trees grow new plants, house different animals, and reveal possibilities. Just like a garden needs light to grow, so do trees. Like windstorms or fire, when large areas are cut, they open up space. As more sunlight reaches the forest floor, new plants grow. In time, a diverse mosaic of colors and textures will rise from and cover the forest.
So those are a couple of examples of the development process for our message. In terms of lessons learned, I think one of the key things is that language matters, and we really needed to take time to clarify. Within our multidisciplinary team, there was some technical jargon across individuals and disciplines. So it took time to elaborate and share what folks meant and how we could communicate. And similarly, initially we had some technical jargon in the messaging and had to really work towards simplifying that. And it was good to take the time to get the feedback, not only from communication experts, but also the visitors themselves. Also, in terms of the best practice optimization across the written, verbal, and visual presentation, we had a number of language choices to make, right? Word choices, the number of words, the grade leveling to 8th grade. We really did our best on that, and we brought our grade level reading down several levels, but it wasn't 100% successful. But we deemed it okay because of the word choices that we'd made. And it was interesting that you would think there would be some photo and videos out there that fit our bill and needs, but we really had to go and collect that individual information and video and photos that we needed for this process. I'm happy to say they're now all available or in the process of being made available for everyone to use on the University of Minnesota's digital repository. So some of the technology challenges we ran across included, one, getting a vendor to do focus groups with the University of Minnesota. There were some issues with that. So we ended up actually doing a pretty time-consuming manual process. It ended up working. Also in recruiting people to do the focus groups, we battled the bots, surprisingly. We had focus group participants trying to get in on the system because we offered compensation. So we had to do quite a bit of work on that end. And then also trying to decide what to use for the augmented reality app. The University of Minnesota has a license with Zapper, which is one of the reasons we went for that. But it's also one of the few applications that starts immediately rather than having to do a couple of different keystrokes. So we were really grateful to have support from our University Liberal Arts Technology Information System on some of that. So I guess in terms of lessons learned, ensure the apps and people will be around for the entire project, because we are facing the loss of a Zapper app, and the person who was at our technology lab did leave. But I'm curious if and what folks you have tried with technology, and if you have some success stories to briefly share, perhaps in the chat, or hurdles that you face that relate to some of the things I've mentioned.
So
Oh,
it
I'm sorry, I
turns
guess you
out-
can't use chat.
I was just gonna say, yeah,
I
it
just
turns
saw that, okay.
Oh, no,
Uh,
it's okay. Folks can put their questions into the Q&A and it should pop up. It's just they can't put it in the chat. I didn't realize that that was the format today, which is no problem. So just if
Okay.
anybody has questions or concerns, just put it into Q&A, even if it doesn't seem like a Q&A item, and we'll see it there.
Okay, thanks. I'll just rely on you folks to help me through that. So, okay, in the effort of timeliness, I'm going to go ahead and then talk about the deployment of the messages that were developed. And again, we were testing these messages with a control. People would just get a basic information about EAB. They would view this placard, they would see an augmented reality, or they would get a virtual reality medium test. And we did this, we hypothesized that the more engaging the medium would be, that the more accepting they would be of common silvicultural treatments to manage forests in response to EAB. So we performed sampling at 3 Minnesota state parks and randomly selected visitors who were visiting those parks and doing different recreation activities. When they agreed to participate, they were assigned to one of those 4 intervention options: the control, the photo, AR, or VR. And then they answered questions about how acceptable the 4 different management approaches that we were using were. And we did differentiate between use and natural areas, because some of our initial work on the acceptability found that they did differ between areas. So we did control for the information. Everyone got the same baseline information about EAB. It just said it was a beetle native to Asia and first discovered in Michigan in 2002, and it spread throughout more than half the US. Or tunnels through ash tree bark, killing the tree within 1 to 6 years. Minnesota has a large concentration of ash trees in the United States, about 8% of our 4 million acres. And we showed a healthy ash forest photo. So in sum, like past research, any information was better than none, but the more engaging communication was significant in only select situations. So let's take a peek at that. So in use areas, and these were defined as where visitors were prioritized, any information influenced the acceptance of the silvicultural treatments in all except complete harvest. So any information increased the acceptance of select harvest with both natural and artificial regeneration, but it decreased the acceptance of doing nothing, which is what you would want to happen. It didn't do any movement on complete harvest, the acceptance of that, but I will say that the acceptance of complete harvest was quite high, so there might be a ceiling effect there in that instance. In natural areas, any information, however it was provided, decreased the acceptance of doing nothing. However, only VR engagement influenced the acceptance in 3 of the 4. So there was greater acceptance using virtual reality for those natural areas. So what does this all mean? We're hopeful that this is information that will allow you to select the lowest entry tech to impact acceptance based both on the type of area and the management approach that you or your forestry group might be using. So for example, in visitor use areas, it's clear that you really only need that photo text information. You don't have to go through the augmented and virtual reality to influence acceptance. However, in areas that are managed primarily for natural resource priorities, virtual reality is needed, in fact. In terms of lessons learned during the deployment of our questionnaires in the AR/VR, one of the things that we had to do is make some choices about the tablets that we use to display the augmented reality. Some of the newer ones we had didn't have an internal gyroscope, so you couldn't do the 360 viewing, so we had to change that. We pre-tested, that was really useful because we really needed to specify information for our participants on what they needed to do to activate each of the 4 messages, both in the augmented and virtual reality. Lighting was sometimes an issue, so moving around a little bit with the screen. And I think next time I might bring an umbrella or something to shade people. We did have a few occasional overheating of our tablets as well. Also, time is, I guess, a big lesson that we learned. One was time to complete the questionnaire because people were pretty interested in the technology, and so they were pretty chatty. And I will say that the average time to complete the questionnaire was 14 minutes, but it ranged from 5 to 27. So some people were very chatty. We did end up using multiple tablets to share the augmented reality, and that seemed to speed up a few things. So in terms of the big so what results, discussion, and reflection, what we found is similar to past research. Overall, people want emerald ash borer addressed and accept the management efforts necessary to do so. And what was interesting, and I probably didn't talk too much about it, was that people preferred the select harvesting over the clear cuts or doing nothing. And that was an interesting result because clear cuts or the complete harvest with natural regeneration typically is not preferred. But we use both text and photos to display that. And the photos with depicting complete harvest natural regeneration were taken 5 years. This is that photo after the treatment. So it wasn't that initial, cutting scene that everyone previously has used. So another big point, discussion, and reflection is that providing information to visitors about the ecological management strategies definitely can support acceptance of such strategies. So that's very clear. We need to communicate why you're doing what you're doing to get the public supportive. Terminology was something that we really think is important, as I've already mentioned. Clear cut versus complete harvest natural regeneration. Those are terms that we really thought about and went with the complete harvest natural regeneration, obviously, because that was going to likely be more acceptable than the clear cut and is the preferred terminology among our silviculturists. You might be wondering, what happened with the augmented reality? Why did it not impact acceptance more than the photos or text, which is what we hypothesized? Well, we're not really sure, but we think that maybe certain factors impeded the respondents' ability to effectively elaborate on the message, and therefore it didn't influence the acceptance. So obviously when you're in the outdoors, there's other people, there's biting insects, it could have been some of that lighting, etc. So perhaps a number of distractions. To follow up on this and to see if the AR really even worked, we have conducted an eye tracking study this spring where we brought the technology inside and had people review one of the settings, and they either got the placard first or the AR, and then we switched them. And we also had a control group where they just did an augmented reality on something completely different related, and all answered the questions about acceptance. So we're in the process of analyzing that right now, but our hypothesis is that people using the augmented reality treatment will have longer visual engagement than if they're just with the photo text, and that it will significantly impact the acceptance. So stay tuned for that. So in terms of the development and deployment of these advanced communication technologies, we took the time, we integrated diverse perspectives of those with content knowledge, media knowledge, and communication knowledge. We became familiar with and tested our equipment and used iterative feedback to develop all of these. And to that end, I guess our big take-home messages are act, do something about emerald ash borer because doing nothing remains unacceptable, to inform the constituents about those actions, taking into consideration some of the questions they have about relationships to restoration, wildlife, hazards, etc. Considering the context, is the area that you're working with or addressing more visitor focused, or is it one where the natural resources take precedent? And if it is the latter, then it could be that virtual reality is needed versus just the placard. Timing is important about the photos if you're using photo. And it also presents opportunities to share stories about what will this forest be like post-treatment if it's cutting, and then terms are important, as I discussed. So with that, I welcome your thoughts, questions, and ideas on this. I've listed a couple of our most recent publications based on it. I'll just briefly share our next steps are to explore predictive models on acceptability as well as preferences and displacement. Applying this technology in other scenarios, we are funded recently to do a test of aquatics and invasive species. I'm also in conversations about creating some gaming along these lines. All the work that we did here was on site that I presented, but we do have an online database that we're working with as well. And that would enable us to get more diverse perspectives. In Minnesota, we were at state parks primarily, and state park visitors are typically not representative of our state population. They're a little bit older and they're a lot more white than our population. Also, I just want to acknowledge some of the challenges of being in the wild with these technologies. One is that about a third of the people are reportedly get cyber sick. And so we had to ask everyone, right? Do you get motion sickness? Are you concerned about this? Because we didn't want anyone to do that. But as you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to do VR, think about you might be eliminating a third of the people, at least right now. Also, it was interesting, our advisory committee, and when we talked to other agencies as well, they didn't want to be responsible for maintaining and providing and cleaning equipment for augmented or virtual reality. So therefore, they would be reliant on visitors to have, a phone or something. And then also the issue of distractions with augmented and virtual reality. So with that, I'm going to thank you and thank the wonderful team and folks I've worked with. Thanks for the opportunity to chat. The Zapper app is available for free on Google Play or on the App Store, and I'll leave these. Also, if you want to download the VR, we've got directions to do that. And all of this is on the project page on the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center. So again, thank you to them for funding. And that was provided also through the Environment and Natural Resource Trust Fund, as recommended by our unique Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources. So thanks. I'm excited to see what you're all thinking and the questions you might have, ways to improve what we've done or ways to adopt some of the things.
Oh, that was great, Dr. Schneider. Thank you so much. And just as Lee mentioned, the chat is inaccessible to the participants. So if you have a question, please either hit the little raise hand button and we should be able to take you off mute, or you can type it into the question and answer. And just while we wait for folks to either type their questions or think about them more, I have a question. The photo, so you said when visitors would come in, they were subjected to one of the 4 conditions. And with the photo, I'm just wondering how that actually played out. So if they were handed a photo and the person kind of ran away, or if there was like the opportunity for them to like interact with the person and ask what they were looking about or ask questions, and if that kind of like changed that dynamic at all.
Thank you. Great question. Yeah, so when people were in the field, they received the photo, and there would have been 4 of them in the field because they were looking at each of the treatments. And so they were provided it. They were in a little ring folder and they were left alone to chat. And our personnel might have chatted with their group member or something to try and let that person focus. In the inside experiment with the photo, we had the photo, when someone entered, the photo was turned around. So you just saw the back of blank sheet of paper. And then it would be turned around And the person would stay there. It was a bit of an office setup. So person would stay there. They were not typically interacting or asking too many questions to my knowledge.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, I would just think like if they had the chance to be like, oh, what is this? And what am I looking at here? You know, and if they had that like interaction, if that would kind of be more than just a photo, in other words.
Sure, sure. That's a good point. You know, the people who administered that did mention questioning, but I anticipate that would have happened at the end.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful anyway, but I'll double check. Now you're making me. But also to the person who asked about the chemical control or chemical treatment in that 2016 study, the handout said, you know, labeled it chemical treatment and explained it as use of insecticides on individual trees reapplied at least every 2 years. So I know that there are other kinds of chemicals that can be treated, but that's what we were addressing here. And then also to your point, Laurel, about different types of wood regulations, we had requiring certified firewood in quarantine of areas where EAB has been discovered. Any plants or materials capable of transporting EAB are illegal to transport out of quarantine areas. So.
Thank you for that. And I have one other question. The participants, did you get like demographic information on them in the sense, like, do you know if they were from Minnesota? And so I know Minnesota has a longer history of having emerald ash borer, has emerald ash borer specific regulations already. And so people might have a little bit more background on the insect than people from outside of the state.
Yes, thanks. Yes, we did, I believe, get if they were from Minnesota. Golly, that's a great question. I know we got how far they traveled, and I believe we have zip code. So, and my recall is like, because I wanted to do some tourist analysis and we didn't have enough. So we definitely have if they are 50 miles or more, but that's a great point about how long we've had ash borer. Now, I will say, however, in the 2015 project and in our most recent project, we did ask how much they know about EAB. And it's just a 2-point difference between they say they have heard of it, but don't know a lot about it. And that's like 63 and 65%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the good news is, though, that people, the second category that I've heard of it, but know nothing about it, more people had heard of it in 2021. So I guess that supports your point than in 2015, but it's still a big opportunity.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We found that in some of our own research. I know that a lot of people, like a lot of people have heard of it at least some over the years, but there's still a lot of people who are not sure of that. And are not sure of the firewood, you know, pathway at all whatsoever as well. So gives us more work to do for sure. Any other questions? Again, question and answer is your best bet, or just hit that little raise hand icon.
Well, I have a quick question if folks are waiting. Oh, somebody finally clicked in. Gary. Gary, let me just finish my quick question and then we'll go to yours and I'll read it off while I've got the table, I guess. When you were doing the surveys, were the surveys verbally delivered by your team or was it on the tablet? Okay, it was on the tablet. And I was curious about that specifically because I wonder if when you ask somebody how much they know, if they're going to be more willing to say they don't know very much on a tablet as opposed to face-to-face because they might feel a little embarrassed. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
We're thinking the same thing. Yeah. So no, they replied on the tablet. So the person wouldn't know how much they said they knew or didn't know. Even still, I wonder about the social desirability response to that. Like, oh, I want to say I know. I should have heard of it, I guess, right? If they're asking me about it.
Yeah, we've seen that in our surveys where we actually asked a long time ago, we asked about a pest that realistically speaking, probably close to nobody had ever heard of. And we got 11% of people said they had. So it was almost like, I think it's that, is it Jimmy Kimmel who does the skit with the fake band names? And then people will say they know the fake bands. unfortunately, you do see that response with insect names as well. They say they know, oh, I've heard of it. At any rate, okay, so I will read Gary's questions to make this easier. So Gary has 2 questions. Did you consider looking at impacts on urban forests where insecticides might be more likely to work? And then his second question, while I'm off mute, did you consider showing an ash forest that might grow back after using biological control?
Great questions. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure I understand the first one about the urban. And we did do some work in urban areas, and all of that discrete choice experiment were in urban areas, but we didn't use biological control. I think because it was, how do you visualize that? That wasn't, I think that was our team's decision, but I'm happy to talk more about that opportunity and possibility because that's increasingly common for sure. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
No, for the urban forests, at least my interpretation, which is an interesting one, is, you know, your VR was really in a forested environment where you looked out on lots and lots of trees. I think what Gary's getting at, which I find a really interesting question, is could you do this same experiment in a neighborhood or an urban park that was essentially a built landscape instead of a wild landscape and see how people react there?
Thank you for that clarification. Yes, we could, and we'd probably have different areas, right? We were looking at park visitors, primarily because I'm interested in park visitors and they're a strong economic driver. And the urban landscape is very different. And that's a super next step. Really good idea. Thank you. And then, I'm sorry, the second question?
Oh, you already got the second question, but now there's a third question. So we'll go to that one.
Okay.
Which Gary also asks, were you able to bring any Native Americans into any of your focus groups?
Thank you for the question. I would have to look back at that identity information that we may have collected. We didn't have a specific target for that. We worked through our partners, you know, some partnerships, people who had statewide outdoor recreation type participation things. So I will say that we had another addition to this project that I didn't report on here because we didn't do the AR/VR, but we were able to acquire an online sample of non-white participants, outdoor recreation participants in Minnesota, and heavily focused on African Americans and Asians, and attempted to get a more diverse sample that would be representative of Minnesota. It was very, very difficult online. We were able to fulfill our African American quota, but not the others. So that's a terrific point because that would be probably some different perspectives, given the cultural importance of Black ash in particular to those groups. So it is definitely on the radar. And I will say that our Department of Forest Resources has very strong relationships with a variety of tribes, and we are working to enhance those and be more inclusive. So on the list. Thank you.
Okay, great. 1 minute left. If anybody has any literal last minute questions for Dr.
Always
Schneider.
email me too.
Yes. Would you mind, or would you, you know what, in the recording website where these were recorded on our website, I will include your contact information. So. Okay, so that about wraps up our first webinar of the series for Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week 2023. Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. This has been recorded, and so it will be up as soon as possible on our website, and all the attendees should be receiving an email, I think tomorrow, with that information and the link to access those recordings. So thank you for everyone who participated today, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you, Dr. Schneider.